right, good morning. How is everybody? Good to see you this morning. Hope you've had a great week last week. If you stuck your head outside yesterday and you heard a little like that, just know that was the worms coughing. That's all it was. I walked out in the yard yesterday afternoon, I don't know, around 2 o'clock, I guess. And it happens when it rains this much. But when you have water sitting on the top of the ground, it's rained a lot. And so hopefully you're dry at least by now and doing well. Turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 34. We'll finish up Genesis 34. We'll get into Genesis 35 in short order. And any announcements that we need to make? Anything maybe that's not on the announcement sheet or whatever? All right, well, let's get into this. Last week, as we were closing out our lesson, we were talking about really a ploy, if you will, to take out or to finalize a plan of revenge. And as we kind of review a little bit in Genesis 34, you have a man by the name of Shechem, according to verse 2, that raped Dinah. And so as the story goes, even though he violated her, he fell in love with her. And so he went to his daddy and he said, his daddy's name was Hamar, and he said, Daddy said, somehow we need to get her to marry me. And so eventually, and I'm of course abbreviating, eventually as Jacob, verse 13 following, Jacob sits down, Jacob's sons, maybe we should say a little bit more precise, Jacob's sons and Hamor sit down, and because Hamor has basically said, hey, let's just let your family and my family, we'll just all marry. We'll have a bunch of grandkids and it'll all be great. And so the sons of Jacob sit down with Hamor, and basically they said, well, okay, we'll tell you what, if all your men will become circumcised, all of them, if you'll circumcise all your men, said then we'll marry. Now this was just as was pointed out last week, and I totally agree with it. This was just part of a big scheme to really enact vengeance upon them. And we got all the way down to verse 18. It said the word pleased Hamor, Shechem, Hamar's son. So the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. So we wonder, what does it take, and why would an individual rape a lady? Well, bad house, bad home life. And even though he's working with his father in order to marry the family and to marry her, it's still, notice that what Moses says by inspiration says that, well, he was all right, but his family, the household was far worse than him. And so Hamor, verse 20, and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city and spoke with the men of their city, saying, these men are at peace with us, therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. And all who went out of the gate of this city heeded Hamor and Shechem his sons. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. Well, so you have this. You have, okay. Stupid is as stupid does might be a way of looking at this. You can only imagine this is not something that a male could consent to or should consent to when they're full grown, really. The archaic tools which were used were basically two rocks beating on each other on the foreskin of a man. Now you can imagine the pain, the hurt that would come out of such, and the agony that would be the post-procedural way of doing it, or of coming back, recuperating over this. But here's part of if you look at this paragraph, here's part of the reasoning. Hey, we're going to be rich. We're going to have all theirs. Not only what we've got, but we're going to add what they've got to what we've got, and we're going to be a world power. Sound familiar? And so they said, okay. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. You see, there's the plot now, or the ploy, the scheme. Now here's the act. Okay, the men can't respond. They're laying around hurting, suffering, and so here comes Jacob's sons, and they kill all the males. They killed Hamor and Shechem, his sons, with the edge of the sword, took Dinah from Shechem's house, and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, plundered the city because their sister had been defiled. See, there's their reasoning for doing what they did. Now, we can talk all day about vengeance, and vengeance is wrong, and vengeance is terrible, and absolutely, vengeance should be condemned. But this was an act that was done at that point in time. And so they took, it says that the sons, they slain, plundered the city because their sister had been defiled. In verse 28, they took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, have you troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and Perizzites? And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed, my household and I. But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? Think about this for just a second. Look in verse 30 and 30, well, just verse 30. Here's what Jacob says to his sons. Look what you've done. And look how you've made me look. You've made me, notice what he says, by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. He says, we're not that big. Our tribe, if you will, is not that big. And so these Canaanites, the Perizzites, they're going to come against me. They're going to kill me because they think that we're awful. But their answer was, but they treated our sister like a harlot. They didn't treat our sister right. They didn't honor her. They didn't respect her. Now, like I say, we could spend all day talking about revenge and how revenge is wrong. And remember, over in the book of Deuteronomy, God will say, don't take vengeance. And then, of course, Paul reminds us of that in Romans chapter 12. God says, vengeance is mine, I'll repay, says the Lord. I'll take care of any vengeance that needs to be taken care of. I'll dole out the just punishment for actions that are made. But they have a little conflict within the family. Dad says, okay, you've brought problems on us, but they said, but they didn't treat us right. They didn't treat our sister right. So then you kind of take a step back and you look at the story, and I'm not going to give an answer for it, but you wonder, and the reason I'm not going to give an answer because I don't have enough further discussion of this, but when you take a step back, you wonder, what was the rift? How big was the rift between father and sons now? It wasn't that big because there's still, if you will, there's still some family connections there as we keep reading the book of Genesis. But it's interesting that there is a problem with, okay, what's going to happen to us? And what did happen to us? There's the conflict, right? The conflict with Jacob is what's going to happen to us. The conflict with regards to the brothers is, but this is what happened. Anything else? Anybody like to say?
Was circumcision a known thing at that time, or these people know what they were getting into?
I assume that it was a known thing. And somewhere around down the line, I have seen some archaeological finds that called them circumcision tools. And I'm sorry, they're just a bunch of rocks. That's all they were. I mean, they had a purpose. I don't mean that, but they were just rocks. They weren't sharpened scalpels and anesthesia and nope. But anyway, anything else? Good question. Circumcised? Oh yeah, matter of fact, you circumcise babies before they come from home from the hospital, male children. Yeah, it's looked on. Of course, Jews look upon it, especially the certain of the Jews, that is part of their law. But it's done now to male children for health reasons. Yeah. No, it is a choice. Although I don't recall them asking us about Ethan, they just did it. But we probably said yes somewhere in all that. I mean, we were going to. So. Yeah. No, it is a choice. It's like I say, it's more of amongst us Christians, it's considered a health issue. Some religious people say no. Yeah. But yeah, it's a choice. Well, like I say, we thought about that later after Ethan was several years old. We thought, we don't remember saying, or I said that, but I'm sure it was somewhere said. Oh yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, chapter 35. Jacob returns to Bethel. God is going to call Jacob to return. This is sort of a spiritual renewal, which we'll talk a little bit about the idea of a spiritual renewal. But let's just look at the story. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel, dwell there, make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother." Now, Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves, change your garments. Then let us arise, go up to Bethel, and I'll make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them underneath the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. Let's look at this. God told Jacob, "Get out, go to Bethel, and I want you to stay there. But I want you to stay there, and I want you to make an altar to God. I want you to worship God. This is the God that," he says, "appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother." Now, it's kind of interesting because there's sort of a fleeing before the Canaanites, if you will, before the Canaanites come. But God wants Jacob to come back, and he's trying to center Jacob's life upon God. Come back. Have this spiritual renewal, kind of a spiritual retreat, if you will. But notice what he says, verse 2. Jacob then tells his household, here's what we need to happen. First of all, we want to put away all the foreign gods that were among them. Implies what? Implies several things. It implies what's called polytheism, which is many gods. They were serving many gods. The second thing it implies is that they had not truly given themselves over to God and just worship God. God calls Jacob and says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to come back. I want you to go to Bethel. I want you to build an altar. I want you to worship God. And so Jacob tells all of his family, look, what you've been doing religiously, we're going to put away all these foreign gods. The second thing he says is purify yourselves. Well, we're not exactly sure, because you might say, well, what about the ceremonial cleansing that was found in the law? Well, remember, just the great question that Ken asked with regards to circumcision, was it practiced? It didn't have to be practiced religiously at that time. Why? Because the law hadn't been given, right? The law for circumcision hadn't been given. Well, the law for ceremonial cleansing that's found in the book of Leviticus had not been given either. At least that we know of. Could there have been? Now, you might say, could there have been part of the covenant? Because if you think about what covenant did God have with Israel at this time? In other words, what was right and what was wrong? We don't have it. We don't have it. I like what Homer Haley in one of his books makes the statement. He says there was probably a third covenant that God made all of these folks, if you will. But he said what it is, where it is, and the limitations of it, God chose not to give to us. And that's really a correct statement. So exactly, had God really spoken to them and said, look, I'm the God, the only God, you're the one, I'm the one you're to follow. Be careful. Be careful in your condemnation of them. Now, we can say, yeah, they didn't need any other gods. But they didn't have everything that we have today to know all of that. So this purifying here, though, it could be some sort of ceremonial washing, cleansing, much like was found in the book of Leviticus. It might not have been. Some have said that it might have been like what we would call putting away the old man of Ephesians chapter 4 and Colossians chapter 3, of burying the old man. We're not exactly sure, but it's the idea, if you just think about it, of renewing, purifying, come back to a clean state. Purify yourself. Change your garments. Well, this has been where people have really said, this is when it talks about change your garments, change your ways. And maybe that's correct with regards to that. But then, verse 3, he says, okay, we're going to go to Bethel, we're going to make the altar there to God. And then he says in verse 4, so they gave Jacob all the foreign gods, all the little idols. And this time, and it was true through time, but in this time, in Jacob's time, a house, a home, a family might have several little idols that they worship. You ever been up to, I just now thought of this, you ever been up to Rock City in Chattanooga and seen all the little gnomes? And, after you've seen 2 or 3 and thought, oh, that's cute, you just want to step on them and get them out of the way, those little things. Well, each family would have several of those. Those were their gods. And so Jacob reminds them here, and so they gave Jacob all the foreign gods that were in their hair. The earrings. This seems strange because really from a biblical perspective, when we think of earrings were the idea of slaves. And so we think of enslavement, and these were slaves, but more than likely it had something to do, Brother Clyde Woods said in his little short commentary, he said it must have had something to do with idol worship. And to what degree we don't know. And it says Jacob hid them. It's kind of interesting. Jacob hid them. Now, how did he hide them? Did he dig a hole? Yeah, that's possible. Did he just put them under the terebinth tree? Or the terebinth tree is an oak tree. What we would think of as oak tree. He says he hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. This reminded, every time I read this reminds me back, my brother-in-law, when he first got out of college, he farmed with his father and his grandfather. And then as time went on, my brother-in-law went into land appraisals and did that and had his own company for quite a while. And he often talked about, or when he first began, I said, well, how's things going? He said, I was fine. He said, of course, I knew what I was getting into because he'd done stuff like that all of his life and had gone to school and learned a lot about it at UT Martin. And so he said, but I'm finding especially some of the land deeds challenging. I said, well, how so? He said, well, because they'll talk about markers being buried. And he said they'll talk about, go 10 feet off the oak tree and 20 feet off of the elm tree. And he said, that oak tree's been dead for years and gone, and so's the oak tree. But there was a tree outside of Shechem, outside of Shechem, yes, and that they put all of these things close by. They journeyed then, verse 5, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them. They did not pursue the sons of Jacob, so Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel. El, when you say El in an English translation, El just means God. And so it's kind of interesting. El Bethel really means God or the household of God, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. And so I want you to look. It says they journeyed, and the terror of the Lord, the terror of God. Terror looks awful, doesn't it? We think, man, these people were afraid of God. Well, could it have been terror from the standpoint of panic? Yeah. But it can also be from the standpoint of respect. We fear God. And so they moved. And somehow, if you look in verse 5, it talks about cities that were all around them. They didn't pursue them. Terror was upon these cities. They didn't pursue them. Somehow, God protected Jacob and his family. That doesn't tell us to what extent and how, but God just simply protected these individuals. And so Jacob then went to Bethel, and what did he do? Well, he built an altar. He called the place the house of God because there God appeared. And so, verse 8, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. She was buried below Bethel under the terebinth of the oak tree. So the name of it was called Elon Bakuth, which literally means oak of weeping. This was a place in which they were saddened. It's interesting. I pick up the idea, if you stop and think about it, that Jacob must have brought the whole family. The old family nurse came. And it may have something to do with the way he felt about all, especially her, that he brought. Anything, as we keep going, but anything. So then God appeared to Jacob again. Verse 9, when he came to Padam Aram and blessed him, God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel. So here's where we have the change. The change of Jacob's name, going from Jacob to Israel. And so he said he says, you'll no longer be called Jacob, but you'll be called Israel. Israel shall be your name. Now, a little later on, you're going to say, well, I found the name Jacob. Yeah, I got you. Sometimes it's hard to get people to remember things and to change things. But so Jacob becomes named Israel. Now, the reason you had name changes in biblical times was because names were to fit, or they tried to fit names with characters. Characteristics, not characters. There are characters in the world, but characteristics. Israel. You're going to be called Israel, father of my children. And so he called his name Israel. And God said, verse 11, to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you, and to your descendants after you, I give this land. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone. A pillar of stone is like what you would think of it, a column, but it could be. It varies from what I understand. There are pillars that were considered pillars that were made of a lot of different stones. We would call them more like a monument, really. And sometimes the pillar was just a single carved out piece of stone. But whatever exactly it looked like, we don't know. But you understand, it's a marking. It's a remembrance. It's a pillar. Something that they could go and see and remember. And he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. This is sort of to anoint it, to get it to say, this is it. This is the place of remembrance. Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Bethel, place of God, house of God. And so you have Jacob's return to where he had gone before when he was fleeing from his brother. And you see sort of a spiritual renewal, a dedication, a getting back to God. I want to jump off on that wagon for just a minute, if you don't mind. And that is that there are times in our lives where really we need a spiritual renewal. I'm sure Jerry Barber told you, because he tells everybody, about his sabbatical that he had. He took a couple of them. Jerry was known to take the sabbatical he had, I think, was for 3 months. And he didn't preach. He read and studied a lot during that time, sort of trying to renew himself mentally and physically, and enjoyed it. Jerry's also been known to take a week here and a week there and just go off into the woods and hibernate and just read for 6, 8, 10 hours a day and study. And all of that's good. But there are times in which we may have a spiritual renewal. One of the things that is interesting, that is coming back around on some of our Christian college campuses, and it's not really a bad thing, is an emphasis on what we would call spiritual disciplines, prayer, fasting, sort of what we would call sabbaticals, things of that nature. Spiritual disciplines, there's several books that were written in the 40s, and there's few that are being written now. I've always enjoyed reading them. I read several of the old ones, Foster and Whitney and others, that deal with these ideas and how to get better and how to get closer to God. If you go back to 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about husbands and wives being conjugally active. But yet at the same time, too, it said that there might come a time in which a couple would abstain. And the only time in which that was to happen is to be done with fasting and prayer. In other words, there was to be a time in which a spiritual renewal or spiritual dedication was to be given. And then they were, according to what Paul told the church there, they would come back together again. Husband and wives were to come back together again and give themselves to each other. There are times in which you and I in our lives may go about it differently because the Bible doesn't give us a prescribed way or a prescribed manner. But we may give ourselves to, say, fasting. We're not gonna eat lunch for this week. But during that time, we're gonna spend that time when we normally eat lunch. We're gonna spend that time Bible study, and we're gonna spend that time in prayer, spiritual renewal. Or, at night, instead of watching a show from 8 to 9 o'clock, which is when we always watch a show together, we're going to give ourselves to Bible reading and to prayer and to family devotional time. Whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But in many ways, that's what God has called Jacob to do. Come on back and let's get rid of all these idols. Let's get rid of all this idol worship. Let's just get back and follow God. We need to do that from time to time, just to remind ourselves of the relationship that we have with God and to be renewed in that relationship with God. Anything anybody like to say before we move on?
That would be the high point of Bethel's existence, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. This is its pinnacle. Downhill from here. But yes, good question. Anything else? Well, sadly, Rachel's life comes to an end now. Verse 16, they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, Rachel labored in childbirth. And she had a hard labor. Ephrath was close to Bethlehem. If that helps you any from a biblical geography standpoint. She had a hard labor. And then in verse 17 it says she came to pass that when she was in hard labor, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you'll have this son also." And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, as she called his name Ben-Oni. But his father called him Benjamin. Ben-Oni means son of my sorrow. And I'm sure he couldn't live with that. The privilege of the mother, if you will, to name the child. I don't know how you all did that. Suzanne and I did it. We had a name picked out for a boy and a name picked out for a girl, and then as soon as she got pregnant, they weren't good enough. So we changed them. And so Rachel here, she names this child Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow, but Jacob, I can't live with that. So he changed it to Benjamin, son of my right hand, most loving child, his youngest. And so as he changed his name, Rachel died and was buried. And on the way to Ephrath, that's Bethlehem, that Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Now, is that pillar still there? No, but to this day meant when Moses was writing, so years later, that monument, if you will, that grave marker was still there, which tells you this, at least to me. Moses either saw it or knew that it was there. So Moses may have visited it. May have. I'm not saying he did, but he may have. And so that's kind of interesting, at least for me to think about, that they knew it was there. There was a gospel preacher, and I won't tell you in what town, but there was a gospel preacher very well known in the Brotherhood that had been dead for quite a few years. And I was with another older preacher, and we were doing a funeral, and as we entered, driving into the cemetery to the grave of the individual that we were going to bury, he said, in this area somewhere, so-and-so has passed, that was well known, said was buried. And so that's interesting. So a few days later, I had the opportunity to go back to that cemetery by myself to find the grave marker. And I went back to find the grave marker. And this man had been dead for quite a few years, and the only grave marker that was there was a temporary marker that marked his grave. Now, I will say it took even a few more years after that, but the family did finally put a monument on his gravesite. And it's not necessary that we do that. We do it as a custom in this day and age. But it is to say that it marks the spot, if you will, where whoever it is has passed away, and here their remains were put into the earth. And, you may think that bad and sad and tragic. It is sort of part of the closing of a story, if you will, that we can do that, and it's not always bad. Some folks go back to the cemetery and visit where they buried their loved ones quite often, and some do not. My sister does not want to go to a cemetery, but others go quite often, and some go quite often until time passes, and then as time passes, that importance and that feeling kind of wears off. And it's whatever people feel. There's no right or wrong to it, and it's whatever helps. But it is kind of interesting that Jacob did say, okay, here's where she's buried. And Israel, verse 21, journeyed and pitched his tent. Israel, remember, that's Jacob, pitched his tent toward the tower of Eder, or Adir. This was a tower that became a lookout post for shepherds. It happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Well, Reuben is the firstborn, and Reuben's going to lose his birthright over this. This is an act that was not considered right. It's kind of interesting. You throw these two things just come. And sometimes in Genesis, at least for me, as I study Genesis, it's always interesting because some of it is not in chronological sequence. In other words, when Rachel here is dying and she names her son Benoni, then Jacob, Israel, changes his name to Benjamin. It almost reads as if he did it immediately. But it was probably a while. Now, how long? Who knows? But it's probably a while. And so we read these two verses and we think, wow, man, they built a tower which became a lookout for the shepherds somewhere around Jerusalem. And now all of a sudden, here we have Reuben doing this, laying with his father's concubine, and how sad that is. But why is it there? Well, keep reading and we'll find out. Now, mind you, we have to read a few more chapters, but now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservants, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservants, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. And so we have the children, but we don't have all the children mentioned here. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre in Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his son Esau and Jacob buried him. I agree with a lot of the commentaries, what little I know and what little I've been able to piece together. But there's several of them that make this statement about verse 27 and 28 and 29, that these verses, as we have them, these three verses, may not be in the right spot chronologically. And so it's a topical, if you will, paragraph. I'm not saying that these aren't inspired. that these aren't from God. That God, I'm just simply saying that if we were telling the story as it flowed, this might not have come at this point. It might have come years earlier, and thus a few chapters back. But it is interesting because you have two sons, and notice how they're mentioned. Notice not Jacob and Esau and his sons Esau and Jacob. Older first and then younger. Although Jacob was given the blessing, although Jacob, as we mentioned, we talked about this when we studied it, Jacob is mentioned first because he received the blessing, the birthright. It is interesting that whatever time this was, that the brothers are united. Is this before the falling out? Well, of course not. Why? Because Isaac was alive at fallout. So sometime afterwards, the brothers came together and they buried their father. And they buried him together. Once estranged, now reunited. What is believed with regards to Isaac is that when Jacob went in and got the birthright, as we studied those verses, it seemed as if that Isaac was but a few days. Most folks believe that have studied this far more than I. Most folks believe that what happened is that Isaac rallied and lived for several years after Jacob received the birthright. And so that's very possible. I can't say that definitively because all I'm going on is based upon what others have said that have studied it far more than I. And it sounds very plausible to me. I was thinking, when I was looking at this again the other day, I was thinking of a man, I won't call his name, but he was a grandfather of some folks that went to church where I was preaching at the time, and they called in hospice. And they said, okay, you all need to get ready. Now, hospice, if you know anything about hospice usually is you could go anywhere from right now to about 2 years. And after about 2 years, hospice kind of turns you back over. This man went through hospice, rallied, lived several more years. They called in hospice, rallied the second time. And the third time, he didn't make it the third time, but, they called in hospice 3 times on that man. And like I say, he'd go the 2 years and they'd say, we're going to turn you back over. He'd have a pretty good while, and then they thought he was going to die again. So it's possible. And that's why I say that. But it's possible. Let me, if you don't mind, anything anybody want to say or add? Not a lot there, really, to apply. It's a good story. I don't mean that it's not good and important, but yeah. Think so. I think it's a good parallel, really. Good parallel. Anything else? Well, I want to jump to chapter 36 because there's only 3 verses I want to look at, and there's really not much to say about them. But chapter 36 is sort of like it's the family of Esau, and it's really someone called it a tribute to Isaac's firstborn, and it could all be. But verse 6 says, Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the persons of his household, his cattle, and all of his animals, and all of his goods which he had gained in the land of Canaan, and went to a country away from the presence of his brother Jacob. For their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. In the land where they were, strangers could not support them because of their livestock. So Esau dwelt in Mount Seir, and Esau is Edom. Basically, you have Jacob and Esau now dividing a little later on in life because they had so much stuff that they couldn't, the ground couldn't produce enough for all of their livestock. And so they had to divide it out. And it's a great little point. But the rest of the chapter, and that's why I just want to say, chapter 36 is all about the sons and the chiefs, and it's just the kings. It just shows you the extent of the family and there's all it is names after names after names. And so we're going to start then in chapter 37 as we make a turn and we start focusing on Joseph. And this is the part of Genesis that I really do like. 37 through 50. We're eventually going to get through Genesis, I promise you. It takes a while, 50 chapters. But anything else, it's all good. All good. Well, all right. Well, we will begin there next week. If you don't mind, let's bow and have a word of prayer. Let's especially remember our folks that are going through such terrible plight. Our brethren, we have a lot of brethren there. There was one preacher that I knew of that was in the Ukraine. He is now, well, I don't know exactly like today where he is, but he did get to Poland, and so he is safe. And but he preaches down in Winfield, Alabama, and he's a good guy. He was at Freed Hardman. He's a little bit younger than I am, a couple of years younger than I am. And I know him more since Freed Hardman than I did when we were in Freed Hardman. But his wife, Suzanne said, was in some of her education classes. And but he's safe, and so we're thankful for that. But let's remember the folks in the Ukraine. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful for the opportunity that's ours to come and study your word, spend time meditating upon the things that you revealed to us of old that will help us and do help us to understand our present as we look back over our past. We ask that you watch over us and that you bless us. We're especially mindful of those in the Ukraine. We're especially mindful of the things that are going on. We ask, first of all, that calm heads might prevail, that folks that are in leadership capacities may learn to rethink what's going on, may begin to have minds and mindsets towards peace, that the region may be at peace again, and that we also ask that you be with those that are our brethren in the Ukraine, that you bless them and watch over them and give them safety. We realize they're going through a very terrible and traumatic time in their lives, and we ask that you give them the peace that only they can have in such terrible times. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us, and that you hold us as we hold to you, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Thank y'all. Y'all have a great week.